Hey kids, howdy and welcome. It is time once again for Conscious Embodiment, Astrology, and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. We are here on the 18th of November, 18th through the 24th. And it's a big week. I thought last week was big because of that flippin' full moon that was wild.
This is bigger than a full moon?
Well, it's bigger. Actually, that's a great sort of thing to sort of push up against this, because I'm talking about Pluto changing signs.
Oh,
and so
okay.
On one hand, it's not as big as a full moon from the transit perspective, that a full moon is an experience we move through energetically.
Mm-hmm.
And an ingress of a planet, especially one that's as slow as Pluto, isn't necessarily going to be something we're going to feel on November 19th. I will, because I'm very sensitive to those ingress moments, but it's about the existential fact that we are switching generations and moving through the Pluto return to the United States. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's start with a question. Hi, Michael and Zoe. I'm a dedicated listener and follower of your work and am grateful for your insights. I always find something new to add to my understanding of how our bodies interact with the cosmos when I listen. Thank you. My question, and you're welcome. This is from Lauren, by the way, if I haven't said. Lauren continues by saying, can you explain the difference in what a person would likely experience during a nodal return versus a nodal reversal? When approximately do these aspects happen during a lifetime, and what is a good way to think about and approach them? Thank you for your time and consideration. Warm regards, Lauren. Well, I picked this question because the nodes of the moon are just up for me today. There's a little bookstore in Amityville, Long Island that I love and have had a connection with, and we just talked this morning. I'm going to be there on the solstice of next year, doing a nodes of the moon workshop. In astrology, because the South Node is such a powerful point representing our past, our psychic entrance into this life, what we are good at, and what we sort of come pre-installed, prepared to work on. And the North Node represents our dharma, our destiny, our life purpose, why we're here, what we're like, give to the world. And if you don't know astrology and don't know your charts, you can still get a beautiful kind of archetypal sense of an energy that you come pre-installed with and what you're here to learn and figure out. And of course, if you know your chart in detail, you can see what transits are connected to each node, what the support is for understanding how you come into this world and where you're going. So the nodes of the moon connect to the lunar cycle itself. In fact, out in the cosmos, these nodes are the vectors of energy. When the geometry is in alignment every 6 months, where the sun is near one of these nodes, we have eclipses. So the power of eclipses as fated and transformational are what then land in a chart as your South Node and North Node. That's why they're so powerful within the chart, because they're doing something powerful in the cosmos, so that when we take our first breath, we have the imprinting at an individual level of what your South Node is, what your North Node is. So because it's connected to the lunar cycle and eclipses, then it falls into something called the Saros cycle, S-A-R-O-S, which is a 19-year cycle of how new moons and full moons work. A simple way of putting them is that if, like when I was born, South Node in Cap, North in Cancer, 19 years later, the South Node was back in Capricorn, the North Node was back in Cancer. 19 years after that, the South Node is back in Capricorn, the North Node is back in Cancer. So what's established in the nodes at birth is the beginning of a 19-year cycle of the nodes of the moon traveling around your chart and coming back to where they were at birth every 19 years. Let's call it 20 for the sake of easy math. This is generational. That means the first 20 years of your life are like one round of your karmic dharmic expression. Then your 20s to 40 are a second, then 40 to 60, then 60 to 80, 80 to 100 if you live that long. So with every 20-year passage in us, we're completing what we call a nodal return. When a person is in a nodal return, they are in a kind of generational passage of what it is to be a person in your adulthood, early 20, the power years of 20 to 40, and the delivery years of wisdom 40 to 60. Each one of those chapters starts with returning to the idea of this is why I came. So it's not so much, Lauren's asking, like, what can someone expect? It's definitely not a transit of this'll happen or that'll happen. It's more of an existential sense of there'll be a natural and organic understanding of the shift in your life's expression of karma and dharma. Just think about the ages themselves. When we're 21, we're like adults. That's a big threshold. Well, that's the first 20 years. When we turn 40, we have a crisis. That's the beginning of the next chapter. If we successfully reach where I am at 61 and we're doing it right, we get to the wisdom chapter. And so with each of those turnings at 20 and 40 and 60, there will be this astrological sort of reset to your factory installation settings for why I came, what I'm to do. Halfway in between each of those nodal returns is what we call a nodal reset. You called it a reversal. I call it a reset. Reversal is fine. It just means that everybody experiences the south node transiting their north node and the north node transiting their south node. The important piece of this is when the south node transits anything in your chart, it's about letting go of the past. The south node is the past. We sometimes call the south node the dragon's tail. And when the south node flies by a planet or point in the chart, it's like the dragon's tail of processing the past comes flipping through saying, get rid of all that shit. So if the north node in your chart is about where you're going next and what your future is to be, the nodal reset or reversal is a moment where stuff might be taken away from our lives that inhibit our ability to move powerfully forward. But again, slow transit. The nodes are in a sign for 18 months total. They're only going to be exact on your nodal path for about a week within that year and a half. So I invite you, Lauren, and others to, again, even with the nodal reset, to think of it existentially. And the question to ask would be, am I fully resolved in my past challenges that I'm ready to move forward with less weight? And what do I have to sweep out of the way to move forward more powerfully? So it's a time of release and reset. And then 10 years later, we'll have the next nodal return, and you're through one of those chapter changes. So there's three things that are up this week that I want to talk about before I back up and talk about the big kahuna of Pluto changing signs. First and foremost, we're in a mansion change. We move into the Sagittarius mansion on the 21st. I think it's interesting that this last mansion of the solar year sort of moving into darkness is the mansion ruled by Jupiter, the planet of expansion, at a time when we're not expanding. I think that's fascinating archetypally. So with, again, always, my apologies to my listeners from down under, because I do have a small following from down under. you guys are living in an opposite sensibility of how these archetypes were first generated, because they were all generated in the Northern Hemisphere, and they all follow the light, right? We started astrology by simply looking up at the sun like 6 and 7 and 8,000 years ago, and about 4, 5, 6,000, astrology began to rise up in Zoroastria, and then Babylon, and then Greece, and then Rome, and then Europe. So because Western astrology follows the sun, we move into the Scorpio mansion just as we're coming to the death of the solar year. And things are turning from fresh to brown and colored and more towards death. And we understand Scorpio as the mansion of death, which makes complete sense because the days are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. We are further and further away from spring, and we're not anywhere near harvest. We're being prepared in Scorpio to go towards the dark of winter. And then when the mansion changes, and at the end of this mansion, we have the dead of winter with the winter solstice, that the mansion is Jupiterian. It's all about expansion and travel and education and spiritual seeking at a moment where we're not really doing any of that. Think about 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. Winter came and we didn't budge. And hopefully you had some, stuff in
Food.
the root cellar or something, right? However that worked.
Yeah.
So what I love about this is from an existential perspective, this is something we all have to learn as human beings, that when the appearance out there is of dark, that there's an internal light that doesn't go away, that we know when it returns in the spring and summer, and it's very obvious to us, our job when the outside world is moving towards dark and death, that we turn within and find the light. And so I love that kookiness of I don't know if kooky is the right word, but like the sort of irony of, as it's getting darker, we move into a mansion that's about exploration and movement. And Jupiter rules the next 4 weeks. So all you Sagittarius folk out there, enjoy. I'm a Sagittarius rising, so I love this mansion.
I feel like I get along with a lot of Sagittarius. I've dated a lot of Sagittarius. And then I also have a small handful of Scorpio Sagittarius friends. I don't know. I'm curious on that. I guess that's my question of the week. As an Aquarius, what's up with that? And yeah.
Well, I love hearing that about Sag from you, in that I didn't know that was so about you. And as a Sagittarius rising, it kind of explains how easily into connection you and I fell. Even back when we met in Inspired Spiritual Community, there was, for me at any rate, an ease about you. Like when I met you, I didn't have any question about whether you'd be someone I would connect with or not. Like it was like, oh, that one, so yay.
Yeah.
Which, not to harsh on the community, this is true of any community, I did not feel that way about everybody.
Yeah.
So I have heard what you are describing from many people in life, that there are people who have a really constant and consistent sense of attraction. And for you, it makes sense because your north node of Dharma and destiny is in Sagittarius.
Whoa. Okay.
In the
full
ninth
circle.
house, which is Sagittarius's natural ruling house, because of the way your chart is set up. Many of the houses in your natal chart are ruled by their actual owner. You also have this thing called part of fortune, which is just like a degree of good fortune for you that's also in Sagittarius. So when you meet anybody who's bubbling up with Sag energy, and Sag energy is hard to miss out in public because it's a visible energy of extroversion and movement, right? You feel that energy as both something you get from that part of fortune, but that also there's an energy of, oh, my future's in that direction of that energy. So you're like, I'll line up with you. I'll hitch my star to your wagon. It feels right. So it's your season. So I look forward to hearing about yummy connections you make in the next 4 weeks after the mansion change. So there's news about Mars, but it's not terribly interesting news because the really interesting news is when he will turn around on December 6th. The real big news is on December 6th when he turns around. Although it might be the 5th. I'm not sure. 5th or 6th. I can't remember. My note says the 6th, but then my mind is saying, is it the 5th? At any rate, in early December, Mars will turn around. And when we get there, I won't be confused about what date it is. But know that once we get to like Saturday, Mars is stationing, meaning he's moving so slowly between Thursday and early December that our movement is going to be slow and sluggish as well. I mean, that might vary from person to person. I know I'll be curious about my energy as Mars slows down because I'm struggling with, chronic fatigue and big energy challenges. That's sort of what I'm working. I'm using the Mars retrograde to process my relationship to my physical body and energy. So there'll be much, much more to talk about this when we get into the 2 weeks to come. But just know that once we get to the weekend, that all of our sort of physical responses will slow down a little bit as the planet that governs our physical movement slows down. In the world of Mercury, however, it's big, big news because Monday, when he turns around. Now, technically, that would be a different podcast episode and next week. But I didn't want to wait till next week to alert you guys to this. Because, forewarned is forearmed, and we all, need to be aware of when the backward journey, begins in earnest. And so on Monday at around 5 p.m. Pacific time, Mercury will turn around. Now, that means we're going to be talking about this again at the top of next week's episode. But again, forewarned is forearmed. I want you all to know that as we finish this week in the period of time that this podcast is covering, Mercury is not moving at all. So you've got Mars stationing and Mercury stationing. So the weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday into Monday should be very interesting because Mars is barely moving. Mercury's not moving at all. He's literally staying at 22 degrees of Sagittarius. And then Monday evening, he turns around and goes retrograde. It's gonna be a bumpy retrograde because Mercury is in a sign he's not comfortable in. He is too scattered in Sag for our comfort. So that right there is problematic. Mercury rules travel and movement, and so does Sagittarius. And so Mercury's capacity to break down travel and movement and transportation is very rich in this Mercury retrograde cycle. It's also going to square Saturn 3 times and oppose Jupiter. That means hard lessons and over-the-top responses. And a sesquisquare to Mars 3 times means we're going to be agitated about how our mind and our body are trying to work together.
This sounds like such a frustrating
No, it's
passage.
awful. I mean, it's really a frustrating Mercury. They're all challenging,
Right.
but some are more than others, and this one is an epic one. And again, I'll talk again about this at the top of next week's because on Monday of next week is when the turnaround actually happens, but I wanted you to be prepared not only for the turnaround on Monday, but for this idea that as we move into and through the weekend, it's going to feel a little odd with both planets barely moving. So, the big news. November 19th, which is tomorrow, Tuesday, Pluto moves into Aquarius and will stay there for the next 17 years, and the stay in Capricorn is completed. I have so many things I might want to say about this that I'm almost at a loss of where to begin. So I'll just start somewhere, right? So let me grab this thought and this idea. I remember very, very clearly where I was and what I was going through and what I was thinking about Pluto when he moved into Capricorn back in 2007 and 8. So back in 7 and 8, Pluto did the same thing he did in 23 and 24 by virtue of moving in and out, back and forth between both signs 5 times before completing the ingress. And so what we were talking about, astrologers, back then was how Pluto in Capricorn was going to begin dismantling structures on the planet. And in a big way. And it did. In fact, right there in 2007 and 8, that was the beginning of the greatest recession we've had in a while. That's when banking blew up. That's when the housing market crashed. That was when too big to fail rose up into our daily vocabulary, 2007 and 8. My business was growing really nicely, and then it took it sort of a dead dive because of the recession. People weren't, spending money on astrological readings when they were afraid of where their next dollar was coming from. So one of the things that I sort of felt in my visionary sense of this transit back then, and I should dig into my old writings to see if I wrote about this. I know I spoke about it. But I also didn't have a podcast, and social media hadn't been invented yet. It was a different world for me sharing my wisdom. But what I knew in my heart was that during Pluto's transit of Capricorn, that there would be peace movements and other movements that would rise up. Pluto destroying structures is a natural, nursery to grow movements for change. I also come from that decade when Pluto and Uranus were conjunct in the 60s. Fast change, slow change at the same place in Virgo in the 60s was the seeds of change and transformation that would follow me through my lifetime since I was born into that moment of change. So I was very strongly clear about that this would occur on the planet with movements separate, plural, movements. Then, of course, 2020 came along and the language was changes like you've never seen before. Will be coming in 2020. Remember, Michael Sandler was like, well, what do you mean? What changes? I don't know, like you've never seen before. Well, how could I possibly have known what the changes that were coming? But that was driven by Pluto in Capricorn, joined by Saturn in Capricorn and Jupiter in Capricorn. So the destruction of the old ways amplified in 2020. And then that made it even clear to me what would happen when Pluto moved into Aquarius. I knew that there were more movements coming, and they came. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests, all sorts of things in the United States certainly were reflecting this great change. And my visionary sense was Pluto in Aquarius is going to take all of these disparate movements that are separate and coalesce them into a singular sense of a peace movement. And holy shit, here we are in 2024. Social structures are breaking down like crazy, and we just moved into an election season and a new chapter coming in January for the United States that will require an activation of peace movements. In fact, when the election happened, I had to completely reformulate what I thought I was going to say about all the outer planets changing signs next year. And I will, and you'll have to come to my Astro Overview for 25 to hear what I say. But I have a much more hopeful message, even though the landscape seems not so hopeful. Because Pluto doesn't only kill, he also rebirths. You can't have a death without a rebirth.
Right.
Look at technology. If you're frightened of AI and where we're going, I don't want to hear about it. I'm bored with you. Life's changing. I'm bored with people who say, we're losing connection because of our iPhones. It's like, yes, soon you'll be dead, and it won't matter because the world has moved on. It's like, I'm not interested in your, boo-hoo, what have we lost? It's like, I don't care what we've lost. We're moving into new territory, and Pluto in Aquarius is all about that. Look at what happened in the last 2 years in the world of technology just by having Pluto inch in and inch out of the sign of technology. Mm-hmm. It exploded. I'm telling you, when we're done, I think in 17 years of this passage, you won't recognize the world for the technological advancements, whether that's
Yikes.
frightening or yummy to you.
Yeah.
And again, I don't care who's frightened about any of these things, kids. This is what's happened. Move on with us or get stuck in the past somehow. There's all sorts of positive applications to Pluto in Aquarius. But this idea that we need a peace movement is so clear.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, this is my perspective, but unfortunately, we've been given a phenomenal opportunity
Yes,
to
have.
rise up and
We have.
champion for peace.
Correct. And it's a perfect moment to reflect back to the listening audience. If you think this is about Trump, you're completely mistaken.
Okay.
Trump is simply the figurehead of a shadow of the United States that was not available to us in terms of being directly aware of it until the Pluto return of the United States. So when the USA was formed, and we use July 4th, 1776 as the chart for the United States, calling the Declaration of Independence the sort of moment that the idea of the U.S. got generated and created. On that date, Pluto was at 27 degrees of Capricorn. So that as Pluto currently moved in the direction of 27 Capricorn, which was essentially, it was almost there in 20, almost there in 21, 22 and 23. It was exact. With Pluto moving out of Capricorn into Aquarius and back again, every time he did this last year and this year, we got reinitiated to the experience of the Pluto return. So what's a Pluto return? Well, a returning planet amplifies the consciousness of that planet when it returns to the place it was at our birth. So your consciousness of self rises up once a year at your birthday. We call that the solar return. The sun is yourself. It returns, so it lights up. All planets return, and they are considered like the restoration of your factory installed settings, right? Jupiter return every 12 years sets you up for your understanding of abundance at its best for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, none of us are old enough to have a Pluto return in our personal charts, but this country does. And Pluto is about all that is shadowy, all that is hidden, all that's in the basement that can't be seen, held by the Lord of the underworld. And so the Pluto shadow of the United States is this is a country forged in white supremacy.
Oh, and so thus it's coming back to that.
Patriarchy. Well, it's not coming back to that, Zoe. It's coming back to reveal
got it.
what was hidden and buried in 1776. A bunch of white guys got together and said, let's make a nation for white men property owners. Women, who gives a fuck? Black people, like really who gives a fuck? Let's just get them in there to build our country. So this tremendous lie was the forming of the United States, and it was just shoved underground for 250 years. So the Pluto return is, anybody watching TV for the last 5 years knows exactly how the United States has been, sort of showing its booty hole. Like it's like all of that stuff that was hidden is now out. That's where Trump is a figurehead. Trump didn't create this. Trump just allowed what was below the surface to come out. And now people aren't afraid to be bigoted and misogynistic and sort of hateful. I think it's fascinating that Pluto was only going to be in Capricorn for the 2 months of October and November, where in the United States, we had this wild shakedown and a shocking election that showed that underbelly of bigoted, xenophobic, white supremacist, Christian nationalist destructiveness is making an extinction grab that most of us who lean progressively thought was done. This is an extinction grab. The patriarchy is dying, and something new is trying to be born on the planet. So as Pluto moves into Aquarius, remember the death and rebirth principle. Something is dying, and the structures of that which is dying is clear. It's done. We don't have to investigate anymore. Pluto in Capricorn showed us exactly what structures that we've been building for hundreds of years in the United States and thousands of years elsewhere. Destroyed, broken down, dissolving, dismantling. And that death will continue with Pluto in Aquarius. And what's being born, because every death is followed by a rebirth, is this idea that we can create a world in which all human beings are cared for. And that's the promise of the age of Aquarius. It starts in earnest this month, this week. We got 2,000 years to get it right, but let's get more done in the next couple of years while I'm still around to talk about it. Have at it, kids.
Did you know that Michael has a daily astro alert? If you enjoy hearing the weekly astrology, you might like knowing more about each day. When you subscribe for the daily astro alerts, you'll get an in-depth explanation of the day's astrology sent right to your email. Subscriptions are only $10 a month, or you can purchase the yearly subscription at the reduced price of $100. To subscribe, head over to michaellennox.com. All right, it's dream segment time. Every week, Dr. Michael will interpret dreams that are sent in via email or take a live caller. If you would like your dream interpreted on the podcast, you can go ahead and email us at dreams@michaellennox.com. Hopefully your dream will make it onto the show. Today we have an email and dream, and it's from across the pond. I'm assuming the UK.
Love that.
And I wanted to put in a little bit of a warning of death and violence.
Ooh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm excited.
Yeah,
Tune away if that's not for you.
It feels very powerful, and
I can't wait.
also
Yeah.
just want people to know
Yep.
in this day and age. All right. Sophie writes, "Hi, Dr. Lennox and Zoe. I'm a huge fan of the podcast from across the pond and appreciate the warmth and sense of community you bring to us. Thank you for what you do.
Yay.
My dream is a bit of a dark one, but I'd be really interested to hear your interpretation. I rarely remember the entirety of my dreams. They tend to run like a whole Netflix series in one night. But this is the distinctive scene that stood out. I'm standing inside the entrance of a house that feels familiar to me. Perhaps it's my mom's in the dream, but she doesn't seem to be there with me. I'm alone and looking out onto the front garden, which is a small concrete space with a short garden gate on a terrace street. The atmosphere is fearful and gloomy, and I don't feel safe.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, 2 teenage girls break into the house. One of them goes past me further inside, while the other grabs me, brings me out into the front garden, and tells me to get down on the ground. She has a gun aiming at me, and I feel like I'm about to die. I'm lowering my head to the ground, curled up and terrified. But when I see she's turned the gun to her own head and pulls the trigger, killing herself instead of me, I'm terrified, but pick her gun up and run out of the garden, out into the street. Weirdly, I have both arms outstretched at either side, one hand holding the gun, like at arm's length, like I'm scared to trigger it. I plan to go to my dad's house to be safe and make my way into the subway, where I board the tube arms stretched, still holding the gun. And weirdly, no one arrests me. I get off the tube, walk to my dad's street, and see his house, which is a house share that he lived in when I was about 7 years old. It was a few years after her parents divorced. This all feels super random, which I'm sure you're used to, but any insight would be great, as my subconscious seems to be working overtime this month. And I'm just going to mention that this, we get lots of email dreams. So this was, she says that Pisces energy, perhaps. Sending love, Sophie.
Fabulous. One of the glaring principles in dream interpretation that, if I was teaching about dream, how to be with your dreams more, that this would be like a primary teaching tool, that all dreams are for us, never against us. And if they're for us, then there are acts that would occur in the dream state that if they were happening in waking life, we would say, no, bad, no bueno. That in dream world, we welcome. Like murder, rape, all kinds of really violent imagery can have beautiful symbolic meaning. So the gun and the killing at the end of the dream is a sacred act of change and transformation. Mm-hmm. So as we then inch through the information that we do have, if Sophie's alone in the dream, she's standing alone, looking out on the front garden of this home that's familiar but not really hers, then we do know she's in some consideration of identity. But it's interesting to me about that because she says that to us, right? It's a familiar house, might be mom's. I think it's interesting that she's standing in front of it looking at the garden, meaning she's not inhabiting this home. Mm. She's not even in the home at the start of the dream. So the first image, even though this is a longer dream, I get that. The first image that I hear has to be interpreted as powerful as kind of like the title or the theme. So if a house dream is about self, but she's not in the house and in front of it and looking at the garden, and it might be mom's house, then there's some kind of consideration for Sophie of what garden can I plant based on being my mother's daughter, right? If she were here, I'd be starting my inquiry, but like, tell me about your relationship with your mother. Like, why?
Yeah. Why your mom and what's
right.
the teenage years.
But do you get what I'm saying about like that the standing in front of the door this isn't really me, but it is the me created by my mom, and I'm considering what I can grow. And it doesn't sound all that fucking spectacular. I mean, it might be based on her actual like home, where there's more likely to be a concrete area than a large yard. But it is interesting to me that concrete space, short garden terrace, street kind of thing doesn't exactly say big, huge, blooming garden. It's a little empty from at least Sophie's description of it. Mm-hmm. If she were here, I'd be asking her to describe it more or say more about it. So the fact that we are in a gloomy state and something violent happens tells us it's a shadow dream. It's a dream in which Sophie is looking at something that's below the surface, that's about change and transformation, that's pretty big change and transformation that we do know has to have something to do with Sophie and her family of origin. You said it so. You hinted that some of it has to do with the teenage years.
Right.
Because there are two teenagers in the dream. I think there's something else about 7 years old that's interesting for Sophie to consider because she goes to the other house, Dad's house. Who am I as a result of Dad raising me? So there's like a dad moment at 7 and then a mom moment at teenage years. Though I would say the dad portion of the dream doesn't sound as nefarious as the mom portion, which is where the juicy work is, right? So two teenage girls is interesting because, well, there's two. I mean, it's just more interesting than being one, right? We have to consider, well, why two? And why does one do the attacking and one is passive? We don't hear about this one. I'm guessing that maybe the two teenagers are the two versions of Sophie from the teenage years, the one that's sort of like managed and the other one that is troubled. So the fact that Sophie's terrified, but one of these teenagers is who gets killed, means that Sophie the dreamer is in some fear because an aspect of self is changing. It's dying away. It's not meant to continue. Where this other girl, as amorphous as she is in this dream, we don't know who she is, has got to be the sort of consciousness that remains. This both arms outstretched is interesting because there's an implication of longing in that gesture. What are we doing when we reach out our arms? We're gonna want something or grasp something or pull something toward us. But she's got a gun in one hand and holding it at arm's length. You know, if you could see me right now, I do that gesture, you know, where I do, you know, stop with my right hand and come here with my left. Right? So that to me is the both arms outstretched is like in my longings to connect, I have a resistance or an obstacle for other people being intimate towards me. I have this gun that sort of pushes away intimacy. That's my best guess without Sophie here. Mm-hmm. Somehow the dad's house is an even deeper exploration for two reasons I say that. One is it comes second, right? So that counts, right? The first exploration of mom's consciousness is where we have to start, and somehow going to dad comes next because it has to be that way. We can't learn what we're going to learn in dad's house if we don't learn what we're going to learn in mom's house. But it's also, we have to go underground to get there. We got to go into the subway. That suggests going deeper into our consciousness to have an exploration. And so she looks at the house. She doesn't like go in there, or at least we don't know what happens with it. She doesn't say that there's dream content. So it's a similar quality of considering who she is vis-a-vis the mothering she had in the first scene, and something in that adolescent conflict and struggle is changing, and it's changing in the imagery of her shooting herself. But that there's also something to be considered about what was like at 7 with daddy. You know, I don't know, but it'd be interesting if it was that a safe place?
I would assume so.
Was dad more safe than mom? That's what I would ask. Mm-hmm. Right? Again, I don't have her here, so I can't assume, but I am curious. We know that the mom relationship and the dying or the, murderous, self-murderous teenager means that that's the consciousness that's juicily in conflict that needs to be worked on. So then, Sophie, dad's section is more information. You tell us whether he was a safe place or not. So that means you're either visiting the next round of dad work that might come next after you heal this, mom work, wound stuff, or maybe dad was a safer place than mom was. And so there's something about exploring that at the end of this dream that's important for Sophie to understand. And it's her dream, so have at it.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.